is broadcasting from the field. And the field can be anywhere. It could be a lovely field in a glade somewhere in Arroyo Seco in Taos, New Mexico. It could be the bird sanctuary at Beaver Lake on Merriman Avenue. It could be almost anywhere. I've even done one show behind the Notre Dame in Paris. Today I am in a favorite place of mine, a place of origin. And that place is the WPVM FM studio, and we are live today doing the show right here, streaming online and also on Facebook as well. So thank you so much for coming and being with us today in the show. My guest today is Nina Hart, and she's here in the studio. But before we get to Nina, I would like to tell you that Om Sanctuary is one of our sponsors. Asheville Community Yoga is also a sponsor, and so too is Leaf Community Arts. I am also very grateful that Walter Parks provides us with a theme song every week, plus other things. Although today we didn't have a theme song so much because we're just jumping right into this show live without any fuss or muss. I usually edit these shows, but today it's live. We have a writer with us. Her name is Nina Hart. Some of you may know Nina. She teaches workshops around Asheville as well as online and afar and afield all over the world. So Nina's world is all about writing. Her world is all about being a member of the Asheville community. She loves to engage with people. She and I were at a little cafe and we had a chat and started to talk. She had heard my name, James Nave, your host, and I'd heard hers. And so as our conversation unfolded, I said, hey, Nina, why don't you come down and be live on air at WPVM FM right here in Asheville on Wall Street? So here we are, and I thank you for listening. It's Sunday morning, 10 o'clock. I love Sunday morning coming down. So Nina Hart, welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio.
Thank you, James. So great to be here, and so nice to meet you. I have a new friend now.
Well, we have a budding friendship, and it
Yes.
started, as they often do, at a little coffee shop somewhere. How many times have we been in a coffee shop staring out, looking across the strangers, and suddenly someone emerges from the crowd and becomes a friend?
Well, we had even a more dramatic meeting. I was standing in line, having a moment with the woman behind the counter who is making me cry because there was an injustice with the soup that I ordered. And whenever I see injustice, it makes me cry. So I was having a moment with my own thing where it just didn't feel fair. And there I was, teary-eyed, and I looked over and there was James, and he was just like kind of solid as a rock. Solid as a rock. And he calmed me down. I said the Buddha had arrived, and everything was much better after that. So I thank you for saving me from myself.
Well, I didn't think quite of myself as a Buddha, but I am glad that you thought of me as a rock. So I prefer the rock to the Buddha. Of course, the people who are listening, now that you've brought up this story, they're going to be wondering, how would justice and soup fit together in a story? So pray tell, how could somebody do injustice around soup? And how was the situation resolved to everybody's satisfaction?
I had no idea I would be speaking of this trauma right here online, but this is going to be a writer's view of it because we like to make things funny and heal them through art. So therefore, I could tell the story perhaps in a more creative way.
Well,
Yes.
one of the things I'd like to just propose before you tell the story is those of you who are listening to this show, you know that often the guests I have, they're teachers, and the guests have had life experiences that I find interesting and hope you do too as you listen to the show. And one of the primary focuses I have is language. How does one language things? So if you're out there thinking about, well, how do I write about my life? How do I take these ordinary circumstances, like ordering soup at a cafe, or putting money in a parking meter, or trying to meet somebody in a coffee shop and have a conversation? How do I take these really ordinary circumstances and turn them into something significant. So in some ways, this story that we're working on now, which we haven't told yet about justice and the soup, can be applied to almost any circumstance, wouldn't you think? So with that in mind, how do you make a story out of injustice and soup?
My gosh, it is Sunday morning, and this is going to be a challenge. But I will try, James. I will take up the challenge as a creative person. So, okay. So, since I was very young, I feel like I had a great sense of what was just and unjust, and whether it had to do with myself or others. Usually it had to do with others. I felt a deep sense of I need to follow this through if something is not fair. So there are many times in my life where I did that and stood up. But then there are moments when you find yourself in a cafe and something as menial as lentil soup comes into your line of view, and you think, my gosh, I'm not going to cry over lentil soup. Don't make me cry over lentil soup, but this is touching something deep in my heart, that lentil soup and injustice go together, and that we must fight and stand up for justice no matter what. So here I was, and she just gave me oatmeal instead of soup. And then I took it back, and I said, I ordered soup, not oatmeal. And she said, well, I think what happened was basically I said, I would like to keep the oatmeal. Please don't throw it out. And she told me that she had to throw it out. So there was this moment of misunderstanding between us. And then I was in tears because I did not want to waste oatmeal. This sounds so dumb, really. But it actually was just an example of how people, when they're not communicating well, things can happen. And injustice needs to be, well, anyways, the other woman behind the counter stood up for me, and I got both the lentil soup and the oatmeal out of it. And James.
Well, I didn't really have too much to do with that, except I saw the frustration. But what I also saw in as we bring up the bigger subject of justice, which often is on our minds, and often as writers we tend to at least hope perhaps we add some insight to that bigger question, which maybe cannot be answered fully, and yet it can be explored. So what I was seeing in that situation, I was seeing the two realities. The one reality of a less experienced person behind the counter who was young, trying to figure out what to do, thinking perhaps that less experienced person probably was being supervised by a more experienced person who did come up and help you. And both of those people were probably being supervised by a manager. Those people were working their job behind the counter, hoping to do right by the cafe. The inexperienced person maybe got lost in her own desire to do what was right, not able to then be able to communicate with you around the oatmeal and the little soup. She just didn't know what to do. So her mistake was trying to follow the rules. And the rules, I think, were, you give me the oatmeal back, I have to throw it away because I can't serve it to somebody else. So that was her narrative. Your narrative was, I don't want the oatmeal to be thrown away because I feel like it's unjust to get rid of food when it's perfectly good. She's thinking my boss is going to be coming down on me if I try to resell the oatmeal. Maybe she didn't use her imaginative circumstances to her greatest abilities, whereas then her supervisor or her boss comes in, sees the situation, and is trying to resolve it for everybody's favor. Here I stand, and I was thinking about the whole thing. Like, okay, well, this is happening here. I didn't know you. This woman is getting ready to cry over something. This woman is stressed because she's new at her job, or it appears so. Here's the supervisor, and they're all three running different narratives. And each narrative is a legitimate narrative that may or may not have anything to do with the broader subject of justice, but it could possibly have something to do with the sense of each person's awareness of what they understood as justice within the narrative.
Well said. That's quite well said. Yes, and I think that that speaks to definitely the larger situation we're in the world of how do we listen to each other? How do we really listen to each other and come from different points of view?
So how did
Yeah.
you become so interested in justice, and is that the driving theme for the work you do as a writer?
That is a great question. I think it is. I think, again, if I look back on my early childhood, my nursery school teacher's report said that I like to play war in hospital. And I was like, what child likes to play war in a hospital? I don't know. But I guess I was doing that. And I was also quite viciously anti-war ever since I was very young. And I also started looking at the educational system I was in from an early age and what worked and what didn't. And being a very introverted, sensitive child, I knew that it was not fitting me. And so I started in high school studying John Dewey's work, Jonathan Kozol, Summerhill, A.S. Neal. When I was 21, I met Paulo Freire, who is the great Brazilian educator, literacy educator. I studied with him for a week in there, and it basically blew my mind. It sort of put everything in perspective about what I felt about education. And the main thing Paulo was saying, one of the amazing things Paulo was saying, was that there is banking education, or either you see students as a bank that you fill up with knowledge, or you see people and human beings and students as already having a great, vast knowledge within them from an early age, from their society around them. They have their own language. They have, he worked with people in poverty there. And he did not treat them as though he had to fill them as though they were banks. He wanted them to lead, them to realize that they had everything they need within them. So that's how I teach, and that's, Paulo put it all in perspective for me.
So from a justice point of view, if you assume someone already arrives with a fair amount of knowledge, you would also have to assume they are aware of the ups and downs of life. One does not acquire knowledge without some effort. And you could also assume then that you could still, in a sense, maybe bank on the basic knowledge they have. So rather than thinking of them as an empty vessel, maybe the metaphor isn't to bank, but maybe the metaphor would be to fill up the basket with more knowledge. So in terms of education, I'm wondering if banking and then banking something into the empty vessel versus adding something to the already filling up vessel, it's two different metaphors, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's language and then there's practice. And I think for me as a teacher, what I just always feel is that full vessel that they come in with. And yes, you can add to the bank of their knowledge. Like that's very important. That is also what education is. But, what are you putting into that bank? And are you fully honoring, for me, I work with writers. Are you honoring every moment of their existence as fuel for what they are as a created being? And I think what happens is at an early age in our culture with arts education is that we judge and criticize and audition children out of existence as artists. And to me, that is a great injustice because people have such beauty inside of them just waiting to come out. And art is one way for that to happen.
You said you were anti-war. War can be waged on many different levels. There's lots of war being waged in the traditional way of one army shoots at the other army, or the rebels try to take over the village, or the village try to take over the rebels, and on it goes. You know, the buildings get crushed. Then there's another kind of conflict, or war, if you will, and you've touched on it with this creative thing. You know, there's the war of the wills, not the war of the worlds. As War of the Worlds was Orson Welles' effort. The war of the wills, I think, might be the educational effort. To will people into a certain kind of container at the expense of who they are. And then once they get into that container, then they're expected to plow along with their lives until they finish their lives. So that's a conflict, if you will. It's almost a war. So when people have experienced that war, and I think a lot of people who have experienced conflict may have a better connection to that kind of conflict than the war conflicts, the actual conflict zones around the world. Most people don't end up in a hot zone. You know, they hear about it, we see it, but most of the time we don't end up in that situation. Now, unfortunately, in California right now, nothing metaphorical about this. Folks who were living their lives ended up in a hot zone, and now they have had to deal with conflict in a way that wasn't instituted by an army, but more by maybe our own missteps around climate, for example. So how do you minimize these conflicts when people come to you and say, oh, I've had all of these problems with being blocked. I've had all of these problems with not being able to tell the story. You know, I want to write. Is it really people wanting to write? Or is writing just a byproduct of another effort that people engage?
There were lots of questions within questions.
There
within
were,
questions.
I know, yes. You
You're
can
very
pick
good at
anyone.
that.
You can pick
I know.
anyone you like.
Which one do I
but the
pick?
main one is the last one. All of the others, the fire and the conflict and the war and all of that is just a way of saying, hey, folks, when you're listening out there, you probably have something in your back pocket or in your pack or sitting on your seat, a memory, all in your little head about something that happened to you that held you back. And it does feel like it's a conflict. So as a writer, is it writing that we're after here? Or is it engaging our authentic selves in ways that express something maybe truthful for each person? I don't know.
Yeah, I work with writers, and I often feel that's very limiting because as creative beings, we have many ways of expressing ourselves, of course. And the limitation of writing and all that it asks of writers, all of the ideas we have around being a writer, all the rules and regulations, definitely, limits people's ability to express. So inherently, they do come to me and they say, I have this block, that block. But I think what you were leading to is, I always say, art is the path to self-love. So you may be a writer, you may be an artist, you may be writing, but when you deal with the obstacles in your way, invariably the way to heal them is through self-love and acceptance. And when you do that, you actually are accepting that which you are, which is a very unique creative being. And so your art might look totally different from what you think it should look like if you really get in touch with that inner voice or that desire to be curious about something you never thought you would be curious about. Like you can discover things about yourself and who you really are when you get in touch with that authentic being. And also it's if when it's given permission, because what happens when you're given formulas and you're told how to write, how to behave as an artist, there's very little way to shine that unique self through that. And it can be very hard to discover that within the formulas. So
Yeah, I'm
makes sense?
thinking of a formula that was broken once here in Asheville before you came, and I'd like to get to how you came to Asheville and why you like Asheville and where you're from and what your engagements are here. But we'll build on this from this one formula. Many people who listen to this show know that I've been involved in the Asheville art scene for a long time. And one of the big involvements we had many years ago in the 90s was to have the poetry slam at the Green Door, which is no longer green. The door is still there, but it's right in downtown, but we'll keep it a secret where it is. Actually, it's at the bottom of the Broadway Arts Building, in case you want to go check it out in the alley behind the Broadway Arts Building, but you wouldn't be able to tell which door it is. So we were in there one night, and my good friend Alan Wolf was there. And now this is all about
I
formula,
know him.
okay? All about formula.
Yeah.
And so Alan was running the poetry slam, and the poetry slam back then was one of the major stop-off places for the poets all over the country. So Alan was having the hyperactive haiku. Now haiku is 5-7-5, which is a formula, and you have to fit into it if you're going to make it work. Haikus are really important. So that night, Alan was asking the to get haikus. And then the hyperactive haiku team, David and Amos Gaines, father-son team, they were going to put together a haiku, and David would write one, and Amos would write one, and they would present them in between the 3-minute pieces that the poets were presenting. So you had 3 minutes to write this haiku, right? So Alan says, could I have a subject? And somebody said, the bovine growth hormone. And Alan said, okay, your subject, hyperactive haiku team, the bovine growth hormone. So the poet gets up, does the 3 minutes or so. Alan gets the scores. So it takes about 4 minutes. So the hyperactive haiku team is busy. So David stands up. He does an ordinary adult attempt at a haiku, which was okay, pretty good for 4 minutes, no problem. Amos, who at the time was 12 years old, I don't know, Amos might be listening to this show today. Who knows? Amos is much older now. He stands up with his black gothy coat and his long hair and, what you would expect for a 12 or 13-year-old lad. And he says, the bovine growth hormone is one syllable too long, just like this haiku. And everybody in the audience was going like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, the bovine growth hormone is one syllable too long. He's right. And he broke the rules, but he stayed within the formula. So I think sometimes when we think of formula, we get the idea of how to create work within the context of a formulation. We get the horse and the cart wrong. There's the imaginative work, and then there's the work that contains that work. So if you write the haiku without the imaginative work, you really get frustrated. But if you have all this rough, juicy, wonderful imaginative work and then the haiku, like Amos did, it's a little more entertaining.
That's such a great story. It's such an example of how the cart before the horse, like I think we have put the cart before the horse. So, Amos was able to still have his imagination space intact, and such a perfect example. So when you take a form or a boundary, he can play within that in a way that a person who perhaps has had a little more structure and less permission to play wouldn't think of those same ideas. And so the two do go together, but it's like put that imaginative, vast, creative, rule-breaking space first. Put it first. Let it ferment. Let it grow in the person. and then let them take those structures and play with them.
Well, I think if an educational fumble is, people have such a drive to get it right because the teachers have always told us that we have to get it right. That was true when I was going to school. It was true when you were going to, even to the fault. It's more of an institutional problem than it is an individual problem because teachers really do throw themselves into the work. I suspect if you were to go through the school systems, and I'm going to say 85, 87% of the teachers would tell you they started out with a calling. And the calling was to help students learn in dynamic, imaginative ways that would make their lives better. And they ended up in an institution driven by anything other than callings. It's driven by metrics, driven by politics, driven by lack of funds, driven by the need to act beyond the classroom, social service agent, the teacher, rather than the teacher helping someone learn a poem. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I, but when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing by. Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you, but when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing through.
That
Well,
Yoko Ono.
well, that's Christina Rossetti.
Did Yoko do a song?
She
based
may
on
well
that?
have done that.
It's a beautiful song.
It's a famous poem written, but Christina Rossetti was famous for the Bouts Rimes, which was a competition she had with her friends and her brothers in the drawing rooms in Italy, and they would have contests to see who could write the best sonnet, and it was called the Petrarchian sonnet, and it had lots of complicated things that had to go in it in order to make it work and to get it exactly right and have emotional, and it needed to be and have an emotional payoff was the challenge in the drawing rooms. Of course, that's all they had to do. They would start at 5 in the afternoon and sit around till midnight writing Petrarchian sonnets. So this educational thing is very complicated, and I think people blame themselves more than maybe they should regarding their reaction to it.
Yes, I think it's so embedded in ourselves and our culture. It's almost an addiction to a way of being. It's an addiction to perfectionism, an addiction to I must put this out very quickly and have it be critiqued before it has time to grow. I must get feedback from others always. I must, compare myself. And that is quite unconscious and quite an addiction. And when you try to break that, and I've seen that when I've done talks where I've been challenged by people who are like, well, you can't learn that way. How are you actually going to become a good artist if you don't receive critique, if you don't follow rules, if you don't do this and that? And when I realize I'm dealing with sort of a cultural addiction, then I take it less personally because, I am fighting for this. I do believe strongly that there's an unwinding that has to occur, and we're all in a system that has greatly wound us up in a certain way, and it's even worse with education right now and all of the rules. So for children, boy, they get it from all different aspects. So does that answer your question somewhat?
Well,
There's always a
the
lot.
questions are all portals for just conversation. The
Yeah.
questions don't. One of
Yeah.
the beauties I like, one of the beauties of the question is it really doesn't have to be answered.
Yeah.
It just prompts us. Speaking of prompts, I would like to pause for just a moment to identify the station and to say to folks, you are listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth having. I'm your host, James Nave. We're broadcasting on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org, and we're live on Facebook today as well, in case you wanted to check that out. We're sponsored by Open Sanctuary, Asheville, and Leaf Community Arts, Asheville, that are doing a whole lot of good work for this town, and I'm associated with all three, and am happy to their support, and I surely do appreciate the support when I'm around trying to do some of the things. Walter Parks, walterparks.com. He's my friend. He's also a great musician, and Walter, I just think yesterday I spoke with him, and he was up in Canada doing a concert, and last week he was in Paris doing a concert, and I believe Walter's going to be around here. He won't be doing a concert, but Walter will be here for Thanksgiving, so I'm looking forward to getting some more music from Walter. Speaking of the holidays, I'm going to be doing something every year, doing something this year that I do every year. I've volunteered to present Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales at the Black Mountain Center for the Arts, and that's going to be on December the 9th at 3 in the afternoon. It's a little dimmy fundraiser. Basically, we pass the hat, and whatever you put in the hat goes to Black Mountain Center for the Arts, and I've always enjoyed that place. If you haven't been to Black Mountain, up the valley in Black Mountain, as they used to say on some of the radio shows around here many years ago, Farmer Russ, I believe, on an AM station used to say that when I was a boy. He would play Nothing Could Be Finer Than to Be in Carolina in the morning, and then he would say, go up the valley to Black Mountain. And there were businesses there that sponsored that little radio show, which was 30 or 40 years ago. Somebody might remember Farmer Russ and Scotty Road Armor, but they're now no longer on the air. But Black Mountain is there, and the Black Mountain Center for the Arts is there. And I will be doing A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. It's a beautiful piece that remembers a time in Wales in the 1930s. And it's a memory piece, as I said, about a man looking back on his childhood in Wales during a really tough time. But as we're talking about today, the memories we have can be tough. They can be memories that feel like they don't have much justice in them. They can also be beautiful memories as well, and you can blend the injustice and the beauty together to make wonderful art, as Dylan Thomas does in his beautiful piece, which is 23 minutes long. It will take 1 hour for the whole thing to happen in Black Mountain. Should be a good gathering of friends. JamesNave.com is my website if you'd like to find out more about that. You can email me at Nave, spelled Nave, at jamesnave.com. And just to give you a little taste of the way Dylan Thomas writes, here's just a sample. And the cold postman with the rose on his button nose tingled down the tea-tray slithered run of the chilly glinting hill. He went in his ice-bound boots like a man on fishmonger's slabs. He wagged his bag like a frozen camel's hump, dizzily turned the corner on one foot. By God, he was gone. And then there's another line in the piece a little later, and it's a wonderful example of birds flying. And I'll give that to you. And then I have a question for Nina, who's with us, bright-eyed and ready to talk more about creativity, writing, and all things global and all about justice. But here's what the birds did. And birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills. Whisked past the harp-shaped hills. You have to juggle the tongue around to be able to make that happen. So, my friends, thank you for listening. I really appreciate your attention. It's a wonderful Sunday morning, and it's a wonderful visit with Nina Hart, writer. Nina, coming back to you, tell us about your experience coming to Asheville. Why in the world did you land at Asheville? I know you told me you were in the Southwest for a while. So what about Asheville do you like? Why is it such a nice town for you? And what are some of the things that you are doing here that keep you busy and happy and in radio stations like WPVM FM?
Thank you, James. And that was a beautiful reading. You have such a gift for that.
Well, thank you.
Yes, I mean that so much. How did I get to Asheville? I've lived in many, many places. I think I've got sort of gypsy blood. But I lived in Seattle before I moved to Asheville, and I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico for 14 years before that, and so we have a lot of crossovers in that area. And in a lot of ways, that area still feels like home to me, even though I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, which still feels like home to me too. But whenever I go there, I feel like I'm so glad I left. Um, Cleveland, yeah, but a great place to be from. Um, and New Mexico, I would have stayed there if it wasn't for the extremely harsh, dry climate, the wind, all of that sort of rough, kind of windy climate that it just started to get to me. So
Right, yeah,
I
yeah.
needed the gentle nurturance of green again. And Asheville felt like a little mini Seattle to me when I came to visit. Um, the qualities of a bigger city with incredible, beautiful nature. And I wanted to be closer to my dad, so he's still in Ohio. And so when I decided to leave Seattle, I came to visit friends here in Black Mountain, as a matter of fact. And the night I came here, you could hear the locusts it was one of those summer nights. And, we drove through the darkness to Black Mountain from the airport, and I was enchanted, as many people are, by this area. And I have friends here. Again, my dad is not far. My brother's in Raleigh. And it's just the perfect combination of city and not city for me. So that's a short version.
And what was it like growing up in Cleveland? I remember a few trips I've made to Cleveland, and I've been there in the wintertime, and they have these ice sculptures that emerge from the Great Lakes when the weather's so cold there, and they look like monsters, ice monsters. Is that my memory correct?
I don't have a memory of ice monsters, but I like your memory. That's beautiful. Um, I did not live near the lake. I lived in Cleveland Heights, which was, half an hour from the lake. And I spent time there more in the summer, so I probably missed a lot of the ice monsters. Um, yeah, the lake is actually really beautiful, and the city has, grown and changed and has a lot going on now, and it's very vibrant. I really like going back to visit. So
And, well, I remember the ice monsters. They really weren't monsters. It was more the Great Lake tides, like a chair. And then
oh,
suddenly it starts to collect, and it's so bitter cold it freezes them instantly. So you get these mounds of things that grow out of the chair, beautiful, like somebody sculpted it. And you could say it's a monster, or maybe if you wanted to go more optimistically, you could say it was an angel. Who knows?
I love that. Many angels growing up out of chairs.
Right.
Yeah, I have memories of icicles falling on my head. That was not fun. They start loosening and start, trying to impale people. But it was a very cold place to grow up in. It is getting, unfortunately, a little warmer because
Right.
of
Yes.
climate
Yeah.
change. But yeah, no, Cleveland Heights was a really diverse, multicultural, multi-layered place to grow up in, and I really appreciated growing up in that kind of environment. And I do miss the diversity somewhat, having moved to the South, just the things that are contained within this place. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and a lot of things that I do not understand or know about, and I'm just
You mean here in
flailing,
Asheville?
yes, flailing like anyone else in terms of
Well,
how to be a person here.
what does that mean? What are some of the things you don't understand about Asheville?
I I guess I'm speaking about the lack of, there is a lot of diversity here, but I don't feel people I feel a lot of segregation here in a way that I did not feel in Cleveland. Um, and I wish I could get more of an idea of how to create a different world here in that way, because I come from a place where there was a lot more interaction.
Well, I think a lot of communities, I can speak some for Asheville because I grew up here, and I know that when I grew up in Asheville, I grew up in the Inca area, and I grew up in the country, and I had no interaction with kids. We were quite separate, and for the longest time, I didn't mind. I thought, "Oh, that's it." I didn't know there was a Greek culture, didn't know there was a black community. My is, I didn't know there was a Jewish culture. I didn't know there was a country club culture. All I knew was there was a working class culture that was in Hominy Valley. And I liked it. I enjoyed it. My father played the fiddle. I played the guitar. I was fully engaged in that culture and have never rebelled from it. But what I did learn was if I wanted to know about the cultures and if I really wanted to engage in those cultures, I had to go off and visit each culture. And so I was, for some reason, attracted to the idea of knocking on other doors. And I would often just go, and I mean that metaphorically as well as I would knock on people's doors. And I'd knock on a door and say, well, what's going on here? Knock on this door and say, what's going on here? And ask people questions. And to this day, I'm still knocking on these cultural doors, as I am with you, knocking on your cultural door. Like, Nina Hart, what's in your house? And I think the diversity, at least for me, diversity started in my own head when I said, how diverse am I willing to be? Can I be so diverse, to diverge from one to another? I mean, in Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and I looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, and then I took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grass and wanted way. So they diverged diversity, and they split into two different directions, and I take one and leave the other behind. So as travelers in the world of creative leadership, perhaps diversity is within our own minds. What door will I not know?
I love that you were knocking on doors. That's beautiful. And I do feel like that is sort of the difference in, growing up in Cleveland, where I grew up, and, growing up here, and the kind of microcosm of North Carolina. There are all these separate areas that do not connect, and communities that don't connect as much. And, I think that's starting to change. But, how do you knock on someone's door? How do you, even say who you are in a culture that kind of wants to sort of deny culture, in a lot of ways. So I just know that I just don't know. I mean, I feel so humbled by how I don't understand how to really be in a world that I want to see change. So, I don't, it's something that really I struggle with, because I feel
Right.
like even as a teacher, I I do feel like there is a certain kind of, community I work with, and, you know, it's just a struggle as a teacher who works privately too, independently. I don't work within institutions, which is great. And at the same time, how do I really be in this community?
Well, and the question of change is an existential question because if we aren't able to understand it, because it's existential in the sense that actually it might not change might not be a threat to our existence, when you think of existential, you think of existence, and does change threaten our existence? I'm just unpacking this in my head right now, but change is like air and like creativity. It's the inevitable movement that we participate in. Maybe the question is, how do we influence change more than change itself, which then makes in language. I'm reminded of the stone in the lake. And when you toss that little pebble into the lake, you have your first ripple, and then your second ripple, and then your third ripple, not unlike the image you have with the Wi-Fi. If you go to the restaurant, the Wi-Fi sign is basically a metaphor for the ripples in the lake. And if you extend that out, it just goes out further and further and further forever. The change, of course, would be the ripple. Or the change actually is your willingness to toss the stone in the lake or the pebble. And then the first bit of influence would be the first ripple. And then the second and the third and the fourth until finally the ripples die out and the lake becomes placid again. But along the way, you've changed the fabric or the essence of the water. So should we be more attuned to the first ripple or to all of the ripples? Or does it matter?
I love that. I think, I love that you say it's enough to have the courage to throw a rock and be part of the ripple, to be part of the conversation like we're having right now.
Right.
I think part of my conditioning is that I think change has to happen fast, and it has to be a very concrete, side effect that I can see of what I'm doing in the world. And, the truth is we're all just these, creating ripples. And I guess what I do in my work is help people have the courage to throw that little stone of truth, their own truth, and see where it ripples out. And that is what creates change. And that, in my own life, when I have had the courage to use my voice to speak up, to create a writing program out of thin air, I didn't know my date, but only had the courage, to put one foot in front of the other. I thank you for the reminder that change happens really way, way more slowly. And part of having courage to be in the world.
Well, and then as we unpack this a little bit more, I'm thinking about the difference between making change and influencing change. And in some ways, change happens at the speed of light, because light is what influences us all. I mean, for example, if the sun went out, that would be a big change. And I use the speed of light because it's that speed. Really interesting to make change because change has already been made. It started the whole process. But what you can do is be willing to drop, and I love the idea of the tiny bit of influence changes everything. It's a bit like the butterfly in the wind. The butterfly rolls and flaps its wings, and then suddenly you have a big wind somewhere in Kansas or North Carolina or maybe Manhattan. Who knows? Lots of wind in Manhattan. Dropping that stone, being willing to do that, and then to have the faith that I'll never be able to measure it, to me seems an interesting, maybe makes me feel better. I don't have it need to worry about what the change is going to happen. What change is going to happen? It's already happening. I'm just influencing it.
Yes, I love that. And I think, we can throw a lot of little stones, we can, but when it's coming from a really authentic place, that's where it's scary. That's where it's vulnerable. That's where the courage really happens, because it's like, oh my gosh, am I really going to drop this little truth? Whereas I'm used to hiding that. Like, what is the quality of what we're putting out there in terms of being true to ourselves? And I think that when we have the courage to be that vulnerable, that's, to me, a deeper ripple. And period. And I love that, I love that metaphor. And I often tell my students Steve Jobs' quote. Basically, he said, when I realized I was just as smart as everyone else, that's when I realized I could, change my everyday suburban existence. That is a bad paraphrasing of it, but I think the truth is, when you get in touch with that authenticity and truth within yourself and come from that place, that's where you find that you're just as smart as everyone else in the world. And that's, I suppose, what I was saying about this culture of criticism that we, of comparison, as coming from that truth in themselves. The ripple is that much more powerful, and people who don't have a voice will start speaking up, because many, many people feel they're not smart enough to have a voice. And that is very selective. And I love that he did,
Right.
And he didn't. Obviously, he was implying he didn't feel like he was smart. And when he decided he was smart enough, that's when he did create huge change.
Well, you can always find somebody around the corner who's smart. A few, but that's you can said, I love you no matter who you are. I love you because you are you.
Yes.
And if we could somehow settle on that, because really at the end of the day, that's the only currency we have. You only have you as your currency. No matter what you do, you still won't be able to change who you are as that package. I will never be I will always be 5'8.5" or 9 inches tall. I'm not going to be 6'3". So I'll never be able to change that. In the work you do, you talk about criticism a lot. I think there may be two criticisms: the good kinds of criticism and the bad kind. It's like the good oil, and olive oil is good for you, but you probably don't want to eat some of the other kind of oil. I love to have criticism given to me when it's done with the right heart. Your last name is Hart. Maybe that's interesting, huh? Versus the negative criticism that skewers people, which I don't even think is criticism. We need to think of a new name for that. It's some kind of nasty barb sort of thing that flies across the air with fire on its tip and hits you on the third eye. Who knows? But so I'd like for you just to talk about those two kinds of criticisms, and then tell us how we can get in touch with you. Tell us a little bit of what your approach is, and we'll close out with that.
Great. Really important questions when it comes to education and also what I do. I studied Gateless Method. Suzanne Kingsbury started Gateless Method. She's a novelist and an editor and wonderful human being. So, yes, I think we need to sort of throw out that word criticism as it applies to positive critique, because it comes with a lot of baggage, especially in the writing world. So, say with Gateless Method, if you were to experience one of my classes, we would say what we liked about each other's work, and we would not offer, how ways to change it, ways to make it better. We that person that is trying to come through, and when you support that inner genius and help shine the light on it, then that writer will start moving towards that genius, and at the same time they'll hear about the inner all the oh, I love how that person writes so lyrically. Maybe I'll start to write a little more lyrically. I'm going to start, exposing myself to that. And what happens in that environment is they've studied the brain science of it. When we are being critiqued, our fight or flight, gets triggered, and either we want to run out of the room or we shut down. So what happens in an environment where you're not shutting other people down is everyone starts laughing. Everyone starts having fun with their creativity. They're not afraid to fail. They start experimenting. They start crawling around in there, like a child. And I think when you create that kind of environment, that critique that could come later is with a trusted editor, with a trusted person who you appreciate their perspective and they understand your work and you understand where they're coming from. So that's kind of role breaking there, but that's how I set it up. So anyways, I do something called writing from the top of your head. You can find more information on my website, www.writingfromthetopofyourhead.com. I teach locally, and I have an online program. I have lots of ways to find me, talk to me through my website. So, yeah, I have a local class coming up in a couple months in January.
So writing from the top of your head?
Yes.
That's the website, writing from the top of your head. So if one is writing from the top of one's head, one would hardly be in the head, right?
Exactly.
So
no thinking aloud.
No thinking aloud. You just
No.
flow and have things
Yes.
happen in the way that the show has been flowing for the last hour or so.
Right. And can I nod to Emily Dickinson that the name Writing from the Top of Your Head comes from a Dickinson poem where she says, poetry should feel like the top of your head is open. That is poetry.
Oh.
So she knew. She knew. She was all avant-garde back then. She knew what was going on. She was not in herself. She was open.
That's right. She was definitely not. I think I'm thinking of, what is it? I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They banish us, How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong day to an admiring bog. Sort of the irony of having to say, oh, I am this and I am that, and look how important I am, and, how dreary like a frog to tell one's name the livelong day to an admiring bog. Nina Hart, thank you for being with us. Say your website one more time.
www.writingfromthetopofyourhead.com.
Writing from the top of your head. So, my friends, if you want to write from the top of your head, get out of your head, open up, let the stuff flow, then Nina Hart's somebody you might want to talk to. Writingfromthetopofyourhead.com. Thank you so much, Nina, for being with us.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
really appreciate it. You've been listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for